Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. The Middle East between rivalry and chaos. And to discuss this topic, we have Professor Farida Farhi. She's affiliate graduate faculty in political science at UH Mānoa. Thank you for coming to share your views with us. So we were just talking about like the news, what's happening right now in the Middle East. And so given that, how do you see things unfolding, given what your background is and what you have watched today or heard today on the news?
Well, there are several things going on in the Middle East at the same time, none of them particularly very positive or with potential of something positive happening, with the exception of perhaps nuclear negotiations with Iran that are have a deadline of November 24th, and whether or not that will lead to some sort of an agreement between the United States and Iran can be perceived as something positive. But beyond that, you have a situation where in Syria, in Iraq, obviously there are fighting going on, sectarian fighting, as well as what I would call anti-systemic forces, forces that are have rapidly advanced and threatened the boundaries that existed before. So we are dealing with a situation where the sort of order that existed before, at least nominally, has completely been shattered. And the question of how, whether or not what we are seeing is a new geography in the Middle East, political geography in the Middle East, or there is ability on the part of a variety of players, including the United States, to bring back the old order, is at stake. There is also trouble in Israel over Jerusalem, and the desire to expand, the Israeli desire to effectively confiscate Jerusalem and religious sites, and the reaction on the part of the Palestinians. So there is violence there. And of course, there is North Africa, Libya. It's a total chaos, rivalry among different factions supported by different regional players, effectively a total failed state. In all areas, perhaps with the exception of one, the Middle East has become totally embroiled in conflict, failed states, as well as domestic violence.
Yeah, well, for the events happening in Libya, we will have to thank the United States and NATO for that. I mean, there's like, there was no vision, nothing. They thought that, get rid of Gaddafi and everything would be hunky-dory. I don't know what they were thinking, but that's what it is. But what I wanted to talk more about immediately is the question of Iran and the United States, 5+1, but basically the United States, in terms of these nuclear negotiations. Why would the United States want to have an agreement with Iran on the nuclear issue, for instance, and of course with that comes other kinds of agreements, regional, and alienate its main allies, the State of Israel and Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, perhaps, so any...
Well, you're very correct that regional players that are engaged in geopolitical rivalry with Iran are extremely concerned about any kind of rapprochement between the United States and Iran. Usually, the opposition is expressed in terms of opposition from the Israeli government, but the reality is that opposition also comes from Saudi Arabia and other Persian Gulf states like Qatar, Kuwait, and so on. Part of that opposition can be essentially explained by what happened with the American intervention in Iraq, where the American intervention, willingly or unwillingly, completely changed the sectarian dynamics in Iraqi society and effectively made the previous political elite to become marginalized. And you have the rise of a new political elite in Iraq that are quite close to the Iranian government. The language is one of between religious sects, Shiism versus Sunnism, but the outcome is essentially geopolitical. Iraq was tilted and moved away from the Gulf states that had funded the war against Iran, funded the Saddam Hussein government war against the Iranian government. So that shift essentially created a new dynamic in the region, with the Gulf states being effectively paranoid with what they consider to be Iranian, Persian, hegemonic aspirations in the region. Now, why would the United States would want to go against this kind of opposition by the allies? A couple of reasons. First of all, the nuclear program itself. Negotiations will end up effectively assuring that the nuclear program in Iran is not a weaponized program. If we consider that to be an objective of the United States government, then obviously you don't want to create a situation where the Iranian government is left with the possibility of constant expansion of that program that would lead to further nuclearization of the region. So the negotiation, if you look at it only from a purely technical point of view, is intended to put limits on the Iranian nuclear program and furthermore bring it under more intrusive inspection. So in that sense, if there is an agreement, a very important objective of what is considered to be the non-proliferation community in the United States and Europe has been accomplished. But the second reason is essentially because of the fact that the animosity between the United States and Iran has effectively underwritten quite a bit of instability in the region. And there is actually no reason for it, because United States and Iranian interests are in many ways similar in many of the countries in the region. So for example, as the United States is withdrawing from Afghanistan, it is the Iranian government that has been supportive of the systemic forces, the forces of the government that have been in power against the Taliban in Afghanistan. So the Iranians and Americans have been effectively on the same side in Afghanistan, as distinguished from what the Pakistanis are doing in Afghanistan. A similar dynamic is currently at play in Iraq, where with the rise of Daesh, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the Iranian interest and the American interests have coincided. They are not cooperating publicly, but obviously through the mediation of the Iraqi government, they are cooperating in the fight in Iraq. The situation is not the same in Syria, where they are on a different side, but there are increasingly more and more people in Washington that think that the relationship, the dysfunctional animosity between Iran and the United States does not serve American interests.
Yeah. Actually, some Iranian troops, Soleimani was in Erbil, and he helped defend
not troops. The Iranians are doing similar thing. They have had
no, not troops, but he and 70 people,
yes,
for advisors.
Qasem Soleimani is the head of Iran's Quds force, which is sort of like the Iranian version of American special forces. And they operate, they have close relationship with a variety of forces in Iraq, not only the Shiite forces, but also the Kurdish forces. So in Erbil, in fact, they cooperated and helped Kurds to
beat back Daesh.
Beat back Daesh, and that was very important. And the Iranians are effectively selling that point. The reason you're seeing so many pictures of Mr. Soleimani all over and making the point that the Iranians are, in fact, on the front line of fighting ISIS is precisely because the Iranians want to make a point that it is important for the United States to make a deal with Iran on the nuclear issue, because that will open all sorts of possibilities in terms of cooperation in other areas where Iranian and American interests are similar.
Yeah, and we can see the cooperation between Iran and the United States goes back to 2001 with the invasion of Afghanistan, because the Iranians helped in terms of ground forces, etc., with their Northern Alliance allies. So that's one. The other thing is in terms of Iraq, many of the political forces in Iraq after Saddam Hussein was, captured, etc. When the Americans invasion 2003, the Iranian pro-Iranian political forces in Iraq were cooperating with the Americans to constitute a government.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in more recently, obviously, as Daesh rose and went and took over Mosul very rapidly, with the Iraqi forces essentially abandoning their positions, there was an understanding that the prime minister of Iraq, Mr. Maliki, was the problem because he had monopolized power, very family-oriented, clan-oriented, and so it was perceived that he was the problem and needed to be changed. And obviously the Iranians were also very much involved in trying to convince other forces as well as Mr. Maliki to move on. So again, it was not direct cooperation. Neither side wants, because of their own domestic politics, to suggest that there is direct cooperation. But obviously the intermediary here are all these Iraqi forces that you're talking about, and currently, obviously, the current Prime Minister's office in Iraq.
I want to a bit later ask you about the debate, shall we say, to put it mildly, the debate within American foreign policy establishment about what's going on and which way they got to go, because this had to do with nuclear negotiations with Iran, cooperation, etc. But before we do this, what I wanted to do is ask about if the U.S. is fighting terrorism in the region. Why would it not cooperate directly with the Iranians? I mean, you say there are indirect negotiations, but in certain places, direct cooperation in Iraq, but not in Syria. But if the Iranians are fighting terrorism, and they are, and because Daesh might threaten Iran, if they come close to the borders. And if the Syrians are fighting terrorism, right, they're fighting Daesh. That's presumably the U.S. is fighting. Why wouldn't they, directly cooperate with the Syrian army, which is 500,000 people, and they've been fighting Daesh and other terrorist groups and winning over them. So what, in your view, would be the opposition to that, or the reluctance to doing this kind of thing?
Well, the reluctance comes from a history of opposition to the Syrian government. I mean, Mr. Obama made the point that President of Syria must go, Mr. Assad. And, the problem of Syria prior to the rise of ISIS clearly was an issue for American foreign policy. So once ISIS rose and it became clear that it is a supranational organization, that is to say an organization that works in several countries and in fact has quote unquote liberated areas both in Iraq as well as Syria, then it was the time when American foreign policy became totally confused. Had no difficulty trying to figure out what to do with Iraq because the United States had gone into Iraq, had installed a new government or helped install a new government, cooperates very closely with the new government. As I suggested before, they identified an individual Iraqi leader as a problem. They got rid of him, they brought new one, and therefore their policy in Iraq, whether successful or not, at least had a degree of coherence. In Syria, because of the prior opposition to the particulars of the Assad government and the Iranian demand, the American demand that Assad must go, has prevented direct cooperation in Syria. So what you see is a confused policy. So what is the policy? The policy is presumably creating a coalition of willing against ISIS. Mr. Obama and others have said that there are about 60 countries that are cooperating. But all the regional countries that are cooperating against Daesh with the United States are actually countries that promoted Daesh, funded them, whether we are talking about Turkey, whether we are talking about Saudi Arabia, whether we are talking about Qatar, and whether we are talking about Kuwait. So the countries that are in coalition with the United States at best have an ambivalent relationship with this anti-systemic force, Daesh. The forces that are clearly against ISIS are the ones that are not cooperating, or United States does not want to cooperate with them. Who are they? Well, it's the Iranian government. It's the Syrian government because of this history, as well as militia forces in Iraq. Shiite militia forces in Iraq. So it's a real dilemma because United States does not want to be seen taking a side in sectarian fights. But the reality is that Daesh is engaged in an extremely anti-Shiite experience fight funded by American allies, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So United States is caught in this dilemma, pursuing a very, very incoherent policy. Today we heard, for example, United States finally militarily agreed or settled on a policy in Syria. And what was that settled policy? Was to go and find this, very difficult to find moderate forces in Syria and started funding them. Or it's not a question of funding them, it's actually starting to create them because they have the... And today we heard from Washington Post that the group that the United States had helped create suffered a serious, serious defeat, not from ISIS, but from another group, Al-Nusra, which is openly affiliated with Al-Qaeda, again, extremely anti-Shiite. And what happened, either the leaders of this organization ran away or they joined ISIS, because, in a no man's land of deserts between Syria and Iraq, what is happening is that people have become extremely opportunistic. Wherever the money comes from, they effectively, that's the way they can make their money. So as a result, American foreign policy at best is incoherent. Okay. At worst, of course, there are all sorts of theories. The United States really is after instability in the area and so on. I'm not a subscriber to that theory, but as I said, at best is an incoherent policy. The result will be the continuation. Either what you will have is an increasing involvement of the United States in the region. Yeah. Again, military involvement, because what is happening is not working. or things become so messed up as they are, for example, in Libya, that the United States essentially says, I'm going to abandon everything and, wait for the next crisis until, in order to show that I'm doing something, I'm going to react to the situation to take care of the immediate problem for a week or so, for a couple of weeks, and then forget about it until another serious crisis happens.
Well, I'm suspicious of U.S. foreign policy for just by looking at things on the ground over there. For instance, Obama, and not only Obama, but everyone else probably, they talk about Shia and Sunni conflict, etc. Well, to me, this is not true. And the reason for that is majority of the Syrian population is Sunni, is not Shia. That's one. And the majority of the army, the armed forces, are Sunni, not Shia. You see, that's another thing. And then to say, like, these terrorist groups, Daesh, etc., came out because of, they have been oppressed by the Shia, etc. I don't buy it at all because it's not true. Their main victim, actually, these are Sunni forces, like the Al-Qaeda is Sunni. Their main victims are Sunnis. I mean, we know what happened to the Bani Nimr tribe in Iraq, in Anbar, the western province. I mean, they wiped them out, like 200-300 people. They just shot them on the spot. They do all kinds of things to Sunnis. I mean, when they went into Mosul, about 12 not imams, but sheikhs, Sunni sheikhs, they killed them. Daesh, which is supposed to be like ISIL, which is supposed to be Sunni, they killed those guys. Why? Anybody who's against me, doesn't matter who it is, I'm going to kill him. And this is why you find also that ISIS and Nusra and other kind of Islamic groups, they fight one another and kill each other. Absolutely. And they cooperate in other places.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why I think it's so important to see this as essentially more in geopolitical terms. And, in the case of Syria, we know that there were initially at least several layers of geopolitical conflicts. U.S.-Russia conflict, you had Iranian-Saudi, Saudi-Qatari, you had all these kind of regional conflicts playing, each having their own sides, and in the process, obviously, intensifying the conflict that existed in Syria. So you're absolutely correct. But it's also important to understand that there is something else also going on, which has to do with the ambivalence of variety of players. Okay, so for example, Daesh, that is now going after a lot of Sunni forces, or for that matter, by declaring itself a caliphate, essentially has questioned the legitimacy of the Saudi government. The Saudi government still...
Which is Sunni.
Which is Sunni, exactly. Which is Sunni. The Saudi government is still ambivalent about not fully supporting Daesh, essentially because, why? Because Daesh has this very, very sectarian, awful anti-Shiite ideology that espouses that the Saudi find useful. Okay, so, or for example, in Turkey, okay, where the Turkish government has shown ambivalence about opposing Daesh, ISIS, it's because of its Kurdish problem. That is to say, they essentially, in the town of Kobani, where you had radical Kurds in Syria, the reason for it, the people who were fighting in Kobani against ISIS are the affiliates of the radical Turkish or Kurdish Workers' Party, which the Turks have difficulty with. So someone like Erdogan, the president and now president of Turkey, can, make an argument that ISIS or Daesh is better than PKK, the Kurdish, So there is that now that it's become very clear that ISIS and Daesh is extremely brutal, extremely anti-systemic, eventually will challenge all these governments, and has created, these governments still have a hard time to clarify their position against ISIS because they have all these other problems. This has become a source of continuation of ISIS.
Yeah. The other thing, those quote-unquote moderate forces that the U.S. has been trying to create through also Saudi Arabia, like the Islamic Front, for instance, we are told they are moderate, and that was a creation of Saudi Arabia with the blessing of the United States, and that fizzled out, and they started dividing, dividing into different groups, etc. And so the groups that al-Nusra was fighting with in the northwest were also Islamic groups. I mean, I heard them talk, on Arabic TV and so on. And they are Islamist and this and that, but they are not as bad as al-Nusra, because in al-Nusra and Daesh, there are like all kinds of criminals, etc. And they asked Daesh and al-Nusra to clean their forces from criminals and any kind of bad people. Not that all of them are bad, because they move through like religious zeal and all of that with misinterpretations of the Quran, etc. We don't have to go into all of that. But these guys that the Americans are betting on are Islamists, regardless of whether they lost just a few days ago against al-Nusra or not. The fact of the matter, these are Islamists. And they were given arms, I don't know by whom, but American arms. And now al-Nusra has those arms, or most of the arms. Absolutely. So they're getting like highly sophisticated tow missiles and everything.
No, absolutely. Yeah. But that's just the dilemma. That is to say, there is tremendous amount of pressure on the American government, on the Obama administration to do something. Mm-hmm. Okay, and yet at the same time, all the options that are available to them are very bad options. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, if you read the story that was published in New York Times this weekend about this American journalist that was captured, he sort of, how he was sold from one group to another, even the Free Syrian Army, the supposed moderate group, sold him to al-Nusra. So that dynamic, because what you're dealing with is essentially a no man's land. Right. You don't want to put troops on the ground, because the American public no longer accepts any kind of troops on the ground. You want to control the situation from the top, essentially using drones or bombings. So you have to rely on these forces that are extremely unreliable, and yet at the same time, you're also not willing to cooperate with people that are on the ground and may actually know more about what's happening on the ground, whether it's the Iranian government or, as I said, the Iraqi militia or the Syrian. Now, I understand why the United States does not want to cooperate with the Syrian. We are talking about a government that has been extremely brutal. So it creates tremendous amount of dilemmas for the United States. But that's the reality of the situation. And that's why I say, at best, you have an extremely incoherent policy.
Is it only because Syria is extremely brutal? I have been against the Syrian regime forever. But the fact of the matter is it because it is extremely brutal, meaning like the United States never supported any other brutal governments? That's one. The other thing is that, is it because of that, or because of its support of certain Lebanese organizations like resisting Israel, and also trying to liberate Lebanese land from Israel, from 1982 all the way to, so is that because...
It's a complicated situation. You know better than I that for a long time Israel was not for destabilization of Assad.
Yes.
Okay, so so there is that component there, but I would argue that it's the straitjacket that had been created initially with the notion that Assad must go. So the Obama administration would look extremely bad if it did hint that through variety of intermediaries is actually sending messages to the Assad government that they are not directing their fire towards government forces. But I think the optics of it are very bad. I think American foreign policy is very much in many ways a prisoner of domestic politics in the United States. So there are many things going on at the same time. And the straitjacket, not seeing the difficulty of removing Assad by just simply words or creating a ragtag army, I think the United States is caught. Turkey is in a similar situation. Erdogan thinking that the situation of Assad is very similar to Gaddafi in Libya, essentially took a rather radical position without thinking about the implications of it for Turkey. Today in Turkey, you have Kurdish demonstrations. It has, you have
very violent. I mean, the army is fighting them, killing a lot of people.
A lot of people because, initially in Kobani...
Who are demonstrating, not like fighting against the government, just demonstrating and they're shooting at them, killing them.
Exactly. So it has had implications inside Turkey, and Turkish foreign policy has become incoherent. And incoherent and unable to work fully, as a NATO member with, other NATO forces as well as United States.
Yeah.
So I think one cannot underestimate these straitjackets created.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree.
Initially.
No, you're right.
People did not realize, people simply did not realize that initially that Syria was a very different place than Libya.
I'm in Honolulu and I knew that.
I know.
I don't have the intelligence apparatus
I know, but that's the political...
Yeah, I know. Okay. But this leads me to that question I wanted to ask. In terms of debate, at least, or competition, shall we say, within the American foreign policy establishment, there are at least two wings, at least, if not more. So could you say something about that in vis-a-vis what's happening in the Middle East?
I think the wings have become very incoherent as well. It's not exactly... I think what has happened to American foreign policy in relationship to the Middle East is that it has become disaggregated in the sense that you have forces that are, for example, representative or very much on the side of Israeli government. And therefore, their understanding of the Middle East changes depending on circumstances, as long as whatever policy they are proposing maintains, some sort of focus on the Israeli interest. And because the Israeli situation is itself, its own domestic politics, as well as the relationship to the Palestinians have become so confused, the kind of support or the kind of arguments that are given, it just changes depending on circumstances on the ground, okay? Now, a similar dynamic is at play in relationship to Saudi Arabia. People are acknowledging that the Saudi, because of the American energy rise, Saudi Arabia is not as important as it used to be to the United States. And so on. So again, the kind of defense that comes on the side of the Gulf states is essentially a defense that says, let them sell as much arms as they want in order to get their money, at the same time keep them not very unhappy with us. But there is no coherent policy, and it changes. The only major debate that is going on, that there are two coherent wings, is about Iran and nuclear negotiations in Iran. And the wings are essentially, one wing essentially argues that it makes sense for United States to improve relations with Iran. Nuclear negotiations can be resolved. It's something that has been used to contain Iran, but in reality, there can be some sort of accommodation on this issue, which will open the way for a reorientation towards Iran. Iran is a source of stability in the Middle East, is the largest country in the Middle East. It is economically solid despite the sanctions, and because it was able to change its political system through an electoral process without violence, it is a stable country sitting at the core of the Middle East. So if you want to create some sort of stability in Middle East in general, you develop a better relationship with that core state.
But that's where, yeah.
The other sides, whether we are talking about, generated because of concerns over Israel or concerns over the Gulf states, they talk about Iran either in proliferation terms. Iran is going to have a weaponized nuclear program and threaten Israel, or has hegemonic ambitions and will end up dominating the Persian Gulf states. The opposition essentially is not a coherent opposition. The only opposition has to do with the fact that Iran is a terrible place, is a member of Axis of Evil, it wants to destroy Israel. It's a geopolitical rivalry. And the reality is that some sort of accommodation between United States and Iran, taking that issue out of the basket of the Middle East, what will happen? Israel cannot no longer talk about Iran as the source of the problem. It has to go back and deal with its own problem, which is major. The Palestinian issue. And of course, the Saudis, on the brink of major political change, because their leadership is extremely old, is not clear what's going to come after. So all those problems will become internal problems for the countries that we are talking about, while Iran is taken out. So, I can see where their anxiety comes from. It's not because of Iran. Ultimately, it's because of the implication of some sort of accommodation between United States and Iran for their own domestic politics and internal stability. And that's where the opposition comes from.
Right. And so that's like the question of rivalry also, like strange bedfellows like Israel and Saudi Arabia, like having rapprochement on the basis of that, among other things, but that's the main thing. And of course, Qatar and Israel, Qatar and Turkey, Turkey and Israel. And although these guys can find like areas of agreement between, like, say, Qatar and Turkey, or Turkey and Israel, and yet Turkey and Israel, they have their own agendas, so there is also some kind of competition, at least, if not, and sometimes rivalry, and the same thing between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, etc. Now, that's one layer of like rivalry, etc., with the U.S. as a main player in the area, regardless of whether it's confused or not, its policies, but it's a major player. Now, another layer is the Russians, the Russian Federation. So that adds more to the complication in the region. And then we can perhaps think of what happened in the Ukraine and like in 2008 in Georgia, and all of that as something that the U.S. is trying to kind of leash or put the Russian Federation on a leash, so it won't be competing with the United States in areas like the Middle East and Syria, coming to the Mediterranean with its fleet and all of that. So this is very important, especially if you look at what's happening in terms of rapprochement between, actually beyond rapprochement now, between the Russian Federation and the Chinese, in terms of the BRICS countries, etc., but also the Shanghai delegation, also, the Shanghai group, which is bringing other people into the situation, other states like Iran, Pakistan, India, strange bedfellows, all of that.
And they
that
also,
is, yeah.
but they also have their own problems.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
strange
absolutely.
bedfellows and the reality.
That's why they are strange bedfellows. Yeah,
strange bedfellows. And, for example, the Russians are very much, despite the fact that they don't act that way, and they have found some sort of agreement with the Iranians because the Americans have found sanctions as a tool to punish countries. The reality is that the Russians are as concerned about Iranian rapprochement with the United States as other countries in the region. But you're very correct. It showed itself, the United States-Russian rivalry showed itself in Syria a few years ago. But it's important to understand that, for example, when United States decided to, through NATO, leading from behind, as Mr. Obama said, to go after Gaddafi, the Russians acceded to it. The Chinese did, but they did not want to do the same thing because they thought the United States went beyond what it promised to do in United Nations in Libya. And of course, the result has been disastrous. So in the case of Syria, the Russians, first of all, had more interest. They do have a base in Tartus. And they also, the Russians also have very, very serious concerns about Islamic fundamentalism. A lot of the people, yesterday there was news, a lot of the people who have gone to join ISIS come from previous Soviet Union, Chechnya and Uzbekistan. Yesterday there was a big fight between the Uzbek and Chechen leaders. And, because, very few reporters can now go in to try to figure out exactly what's going on. We really don't know exactly what's going on in those territories, but the Russians from the beginning have also had a principled opposition to what I call attempts to undermine a political system without a vision about what can come afterwards. And in that sense, like the Iranians, they have proven right. Okay, I don't think either the Russians, and I know in the case of Iranians, they do not have any vested interest in the personality of Assad. Okay? No. They do, however, it's very, very important for them to protect the Alawite community, a secular Alawite community. People keep calling them Shiite. The reality is they are not. And they're quite secular. That's a good chunk of the population. And in the political settlement of Syria, both the Russians as well as the Iranians are very much concerned, but they don't have a vested interest in Assad. But when they see policies that, have no plan for the second day, there is no reason for them to get on board. And in fact, there is every reason for them to oppose those policies.
And if you really want to, as U.S. want to, fight terrorism, which, the Russian Federation had been fighting for a while, like in Chechnya, etc., then why not go through the United Nations and say, why not Russia and China and etc. come within an international coalition, to fight terrorism on an equal basis, rather than the U.S. leading that. You see what I'm saying? Here comes the rivalry, and that's what I'm interested in.
And also the fact is, so
it's beyond terrorism.
There is one's terrorist is the other person's freedom fighter.
But not in this case.
I don't know. In the case of Chechnya, the Russians were pretty brutal.
No, not in Chechnya. I meant in terms of Daesh.
Yeah, in terms of Daesh, that's the consequence. That's the consequence. But, it's important to remember that the opposition to the Assad government began as, sort of a peaceful opposition. But then, rather than promoting some sort of reconciliation, the policy that pushed for a proxy war. Let us not remember that, let's not forget that the initial push for getting rid of Assad was billed in the United States as if Assad goes, Iran will be weakened.
Yes,
so even the discourse in Washington was not about human rights and the livelihood of the Syrian people. It was that an ally of an Iranian government. And that's why I say you have to understand it within the context of geopolitical rivalry, not only the broader ones, between United States and Russia, but also Saudi Arabia still having difficulty absorbing what has happened in Iraq, trying to get back at Iran in the case of Syria. So there is regional rivalry as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's true. Talking about things like we just mentioned earlier regarding why is the U.S. against Syria? Is it because of human rights violation? I don't buy that. But even from I would say like 2005, 2006, the U.S. had been trying. Even before that, from when Hafez al-Assad was still president, they tried to move Syria away from Iran. And in fact, once I was asked a question, I said, the Syrians are not insane to do that just to please the Americans. What are the Americans gonna, offer them instead? Nothing.
But the Syrians and Senator Kerry, who was the head of the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, right before the Arab Spring, went to Syria, met with...
and they had dinner, private dinner.
And not only that, Syria was a very important component of the rendition program in the United States.
Absolutely.
Where, where you cannot torture in the United States, so you send them, you go and torture them over
with the blessing of the United States, because they send them the stuff.
You send them Egypt and Syria, both of them. So United States, exactly what dynamics were at play when, things started, protests started in Syria. I think, again, Washington dynamics and the infatuation with Iran, which had been created by the Israelis and the Saudis, ended up Mr. Obama being pushed in the direction of very early on saying Assad must go. And that, closed the path for all sorts of other policies that could have political solutions to the situation. Again, it created a racket, a series of rackets, where money started to pour in and people began to make their living through that process of racketeering. And I think, that was an unforeseen consequence. That doesn't take away from the responsibility.
Right.
Okay? So it's the same, as I say, it's a similar dynamic. We saw that being played out previously in Afghanistan. And then with another government, the Pakistani government essentially becoming the supporter of these kind of activities that led to the rise of Taliban, because they were interested in their own, to use these forces in their geopolitical rivalry with India. Similar dynamic were at play. United States should have known better. But as I said, because of the way Washington's foreign policy establishment for the past 10 years has become so obsessed with Iran, it just completely misread the situation.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me, watching United States, it being famed as pragmatic, etc., to doing the same mistakes one time after the other. I mean, they can't learn. Well, where's the pragmatism, one might say? So, in terms of, for instance, pragmatism, you wouldn't say, put yourself in a corner and say, Assad must go. I mean, now it is going to take a lot to have Obama come down from that tree. I mean, so it's really bad, because if they're gonna keep like saying, oh, we don't want to cooperate with Syria because of blah blah blah, they're not gonna solve the situation, and they're gonna be in this what you termed as confused policy, etc., which actually again doesn't exonerate them from whatever is happening, although that they might be because they made a mistake yet again, we talk about Afghanistan, we talk about Iraq, we talk about Palestine, we talk about the state of Israel, etc. So I think much has to do, in terms of what you said, domestic politics. But that domestic politics is, being influenced heavily by Zionist influence and by, pro-Israeli, that is pro-Israeli.
And Saudi.
Saudi, not to the point. But there is a collaboration now between Saudi, rapprochement also between Saudi and Israel.
Absolutely. And the reason I say it's so important not to exonerate or excuse American foreign policy is because if you do, then you easily fall into this notion that this is a Shiite-Sunni fight.
Absolutely.
We didn't have anything to do with it, it just came out of it. They've been doing this for years, for centuries and so on. And completely, as I said, misreading the dynamics of the region. It makes you, it externalizes the problem.
Right.
That's fine, but it just does not explain.
Yeah.
Libya is not a Sunni Shiite problem.
They are all Sunnis killing each other.
In fact, some people have argued that this is an intra-Sunni problem because all of them are allies in different ways, and all of them are American allies, and all of them are suffering from very brutal political systems that is now coming to haunt them in a different way. And there is also no doubt that, when you have a region that has been so devastated through so much violence coming from the air, it's blind violence, you cannot expect no consequences of this.
Yeah, of course.
So there is that component as well. And but none of this will lead us into a situation where I can tell you how this can be resolved. The only area that I suggested before that I think there is positive potential, if there is some sort of an agreement between United States and Iran, positive potential in terms of Iranian domestic politics. Okay, that is to say, if the bottom line is that we are concerned about improved lives of a people, then that's the only area that I think some sort of a light can be seen at the end of the tunnel. Iranians had an election. The election, they voted for someone who, quote unquote, identifies himself, ran on a platform of, quote unquote, moderation against extremism. And his platform has economic component, human rights component, and hasn't been fulfilled yet.
Right.
But I'm saying that taking away the American threat, because the United States has been talking about attacking Iran. Therefore, the security state that exists in Iran, one way or another, has been influenced by that economic severe sanctions as well as military threat. I think the only area where you can actually see potential for positive movement for the population of that area at this particular moment is Iran.
Yeah, no, I agree. And yet we have yet to see whether come the 24th or the 26th.
Well, they are the Americans. Secretary Kerry and Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif are meeting in Oman, which is an important place to meet because Oman has played an important role. Intermediary. So if you had asked me a few weeks ago, I would have said the negotiations are falling apart. Today, things look a little bit more optimistic at this particular
And
moment.
now they are talking about just like a few technical issues, etc.
Well, the technical issues are big, and it's not at all clear if the Obama administration will be able to sell it to Congress. And in fact, he will not be able, Obama will not. So he has to go around Congress.
Yes.
And that's a choice, that he has to make. And similar dynamic are at play in Iran, because Iranians also have to make some choices.
November 4th is tomorrow.
Yes, exactly.
So, and then that is going to affect a lot of things. One quick thing about like Kerry a couple of months ago or so, he was talking about, if Assad goes and Syria gets divided, we can like protect the Alawites, because Assad is Alawite, but he's married to a Sunni, by the way. Anyway, so we protect the Alawites, and then they divide Syria. I mean, and then this is like Bernard Lewis talking about dividing of the Arab world or the Middle East as a whole. He, divided it into like 41 entities.
No, the problem
and
is
he has a lot of influence on American foreign policy.
Yeah, but the problem is, perhaps we talked about this before, because part of the area that they are talking about dividing is also the quote-unquote Sunni area in Iraq, combining it, creating a new state in the middle. The problem is that if the Iraqi Shiites take the south, the Kurds take the north, Alawites go and take the Mediterranean side. The area that is left for this new state is a God-forsaken place. It really, and especially has been very badly hit by the drought that has been hitting them. It has hit the Middle East in the same way that it has hit California. And, you let a lot of people in an area that is not economically viable, that is already a recipe for violence and desires and for expansion into an area. It's not a viable entity.
And then the other thing about it is that, like, here we are in Washington, D.C. or London or wherever, and we're telling, the Shia would take this, I mean, there are no actors on the ground. I mean, these people are not agents of their own interests, etc. The Arabs or the Iranians or the Turks. No, we would tell them what to do. I mean, this is like 150 years ago kind of
but it hasn't worked. I mean, they proved themselves. What the Middle Easterners have shown is that they are definitely agents.
Yes.
So because they have the ability to mess up other people's plans. Now, whether or not they have the ability to create something that is allows for the creation or establishment of decent living, obviously there are other factors, but they have shown that they are agents and they can mess up plans made in Washington, Europe, Israel, elsewhere.
And I think, the U.S., so long it is like on the side of Israel with no questions asked, is going to have a huge problem in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East in that particular area. I talk beyond the Middle East, I'm talking Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, some sub-Saharan African countries, and so forth. So it'll have a big problem not only in the Arab world and Turkey and Iran, but also beyond that, even in the...
Well, I think the biggest problem that they have to face very soon is within Israel and in relationship to the West. I mean, that area, West Bank, whether people like it or not, or acknowledge it, West Bank, Gaza, and Israel have become an integrated area. It's not integrated very well, but it is. And it's going to face, and as such, it's going to face serious, quote-unquote, domestic issues that are, we already see that. It has happened already. Jerusalem is extremely tense. There is violence, and neither the Israelis nor their allies in the United States have any idea how to deal with this coming tumult.
With this like Zionist ideology and movement trying to take over the whole place, then there's no place for two-state solution anymore.
No, it's gone.
Yeah, so it is like a matter of, one state, all of them live together, but there are like a huge, these Zionists don't want that to happen. Also, like the Islamists don't want that to happen, so we have problems on both sides. And this is the creation of the, thanks to U.S. policy in that region that allowed this kind of thing to come to that conclusion, because with the Gaza, attacks, recent Gaza attacks, the U.S. Didn't say anything. Like you had against the Israelis, nothing really, because over 2,500 dead, and 500 of those were children, 10,000 plus wounded, etc. Like I don't know how many thousands of homes, demolished, etc. And they're destroyed. And so what are we talking about? They didn't say anything about this. So for the Arab world and beyond, I'm saying, the U.S. has a big problem and has to figure it out domestically, whether to be like real interlocutors and, what do you call that? Intermediaries in terms of this issue or not, that would determine quite a bit. So anyway, we are flat out of time, and thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk with us.
Okay. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
We'll talk to you more later on, and aloha and mahalo nui loa, and see you next month.